Welcome to Curiosity Cake, the podcast for curious minds and big appetites. I'm your host and curator of ideas, Lee Delaney. On this episode, I'm exploring the link between pain and empathy with Helena Hartmann. Helena is a PhD researcher with a focus on the question of why and how we understand and share the suffering of other individuals around us. Do check out the show notes for this episode, as Helena has shared some cool images from her work. If you like what you hear, please tip generously by hitting subscribe, rating the show and leaving a review on your podcast app, as reviews are important for getting seen by search algorithms. And just to give you a heads up on an upcoming episode, I'll be talking with Marianne Cantwell, entrepreneur, coach and author of the best-selling book Free Range Humans, which was one of the inspirations for me to create Curiosity Cake. So look out for that in the coming weeks. But for now, get yourself a cup of tea, grab a fork and dig into a slice of Curiosity Cake. Curiosity Cake. Helena Hartmann, welcome to Curiosity Cake. How are you doing?
I'm fine. Thanks for inviting me, Lee.
Very welcome. This was something we set up pretty early on before I'd released any episode, so it's been a little while getting around to actually recording this, so I'm excited to be able to talk to you after all that time.
Yeah, and I've had a listen to the episodes that have been created since, and it's I'm even more happy now that I said yes.
That's great. Thanks very much. So at the minute you're studying a PhD in psychology and social neuroscience at the University of Vienna.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm in my third year, so I've already got quite a bit of time passed, but I still have some time left. And so I've collected all my data, and now it's mostly me sitting and analyzing and writing.
So I think people would have a really good idea of what psychology is, but can you tell us a bit more about what social neuroscience is?
Yeah, so I also had no idea about neuroscience when I started studying, and to be honest, I wanted to go more into practical therapy directions anyway. But then during my master, I got the opportunity to work in a cool project that used functional magnetic resonance imaging, so neuroimaging, which is taking a look at what's happening inside the brain. And this is where I got introduced to neuroscience in general. And then social neuroscience kind of looks at interactions between people. So a combination of psychology and neuroscience in a sense. And I'm especially interested in how people perceive and process each other's emotions. So there's the social aspect, but there's also kind of an emotional or affective aspect to it. So in our everyday life, we perceive a lot of things and we perceive other people, and we not only have to deal with how we are feeling ourselves, but we also have to process what individuals around us are doing. And this is basically what I think is super fascinating, and what I'm also doing for my PhD. So I focus on empathy and pro-social behavior in the domain of pain, which is for me the most. So what drew me to it was the pain aspect, because I think it's fascinating how you can study pain and what happens in the brain during pain perception. And then adding this social aspect on top of it was even more cool, because not only, as I said, we don't only perceive what we feel ourselves, but we perceive others. And this also holds for pain. And if we see others in pain, this resonates in ourselves. So we also feel something. So I think, yeah, for me, that was super interesting. So this is, I think, what got me into neuroscience and social neuroscience. And I have to say that the lab in Vienna, the social cognitive and affective neuroscience unit where I'm working, is the perfect place to do that, because it's all about empathy and social aspects of neuroscience.
So you've mentioned empathy a few times there, and that's obviously key to your research. Can you tell us what empathy is? Because I think it's one of those words that people know, but maybe they would struggle to actually explain it. And I've come across it, so often. I used to work as a psychotherapist, so it's a really core part of that. But empathy can get really confused with sympathy and similar kind of emotions or traits. So can you just give us some details on what makes empathy empathy?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly how you said. There are so many different definitions of empathy, and people are also, just scientists are still not sure, or they don't agree on the definition of empathy. And every researcher kind of has his or her own understanding of what empathy is. But most of the time, there is one, let's say, definition, a working definition that most researchers agree on, at least to a certain extent. And so if we try to say it in one sentence, empathy for me or for my lab would be defined as sharing as well as understanding the emotions of another person, for example, pain. So we feel exactly what the other person feels. And in our lab, we have a definition that is a bit more complex. So we define empathy as more of a process that consists of multiple different components happening simultaneously or after each other. And there are three major components to it. So first of all, we have to either see or imagine another person feeling an emotion. For example, a friend hitting his elbow on the door frame. And then the second part is the sharing part. So we have to feel what the other person feels. We have to share the emotional state of that person. So maybe we also feel an unpleasant feeling because we see this, the other person hitting his or her elbow. And this is also called isomorphic. So feeling the same, feeling with the other person. And then the third part is that we use our cognitive abilities to distinguish and to kind of, let's say, to make sense of this emotion that we are feeling, because we have to make sure that we know that it's not ourselves that are feeling this emotion, but it's the other person, and we are influenced by that. So we have to distinguish self and other in a way. And this is called self-other distinction, and it's a really crucial component to empathy as well. And as you said before, this differentiates empathy from other mechanisms such as emotional contagion, where we are just automatically influenced by an emotion of another person, or something like compassion or sympathy, so where we feel for another person.
Emotional contagion, is that where we're experience a similar emotion, but we're more concerned with our own experience and less about the other person's?
I would say emotional contagion is, for example, I think there's this very famous example or study where if a baby starts crying in a, let's say, hospital, the other babies immediately also start crying. And this is just this automatic first thing that's happening, is that you also get into this emotion, for example, let's say sadness. And then if we look at compassion or sympathy, this is kind of what comes after empathy. So we feel something, we share the emotion, we know that the other person is the source of the emotion, and then this develops into other emotions that we feel for the other person. For example, we can feel pity for someone that is sad. So that is not the same feeling, but it's kind of related in a sense.
And what's really interesting there is you're talking about imagination as well. You don't have to actually see someone experiencing something in front of you. You can imagine that.
Yeah, and this is what we also harness in our studies or in experiments, because most of the time we don't have the possibility to have a real, let's say, painful situation. And then we have to ask the person to imagine something. But this works just as well. Of course, it depends on how good the person can imagine that. But yeah, I mean, there are many different ways to experience empathy. It doesn't need to be in that situation. It can be imagined.
So does that mean you're not actually causing pain for people in your experiments?
Well, I am in some. So, I mean, there are different options, and if you want to measure empathy, you have a quite wide array of measures available, starting from questionnaires and just trying to measure the trait personality of a person or of multiple people, up to showing them images or videos that could elicit empathy. And then, so the second is what I do. So I show them pictures that look very painful. And the third option is to really give them pain and to make them observe other people feeling pain. And I do a combination of all three, I would say.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm wondering if you have some sort of dungeon with various kind of medieval torture equipment there.
Well, since I also use fMRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging, most of the time, let's say the torture chamber is the scanner. And that's already exciting as it is. And then they lie in the scanner and they have a lot of electrodes attached to their hands. So on the back of the hand, and the cables and the electrodes are connected to a pain stimulator, and then I give them short, very painful but tolerable electrical shocks on the hand. And then they either get this pain themselves, or they see on the screen on the computer screen that another person is receiving the same stimulation.
So fMRI then would be, I think people will be familiar with the sort of images you see in movies and in TV that is like an X-ray of someone's head, and you can maybe see areas in the brain that are lighting up.
Exactly. It's sadly not that easy. I also thought that when I started out. Well, in the end, yes, you get a map of areas that are active in the brain during a certain situation. For example, when we get an electrical shock. But when I scan the people, I don't really see anything yet. So I just measure the brain activity over time using a really big magnet, the scanner. And through multiple processing steps and analysis steps, I then get to the nice colored maps of brain activity that everybody knows and sees on TV.
How do you decide how to go about creating these experiments? Because it sounds like because empathy itself is quite a complicated idea, it sounds like it would be quite difficult to try to design experiments to look at it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I was lucky because the lab that I started my PhD is already very well versed in empathy and measuring empathy, and has a lot of experience with conducting experiments and designing experiments. And most of the time it's more, the difficulty is then to design an experiment that relates to your specific research question. So the empathy itself is relatively done, so to say already. We know what to do. It's mostly about the specifics that are difficult then.
So you're really trying to hone in on the link with pain then? Exactly.
And if we look at empathy and what is happening in pain, there have been a lot of studies done already. And those studies found that when you feel pain yourself, certain areas in the brain are active. And those areas are also active when you see another person receiving pain. And this was taken it was taken to suggest that these areas are active in both situations. So maybe the same underlying processes in the brain are happening in both of the situations. So when we feel pain ourselves and when we see others in pain. And this theory, which is also the theory that I'm investigating in my PhD, is called the shared representations theory. And it basically just tries to understand how empathy is processed in the brain. And it kind of assumes that maybe the networks that underlie firsthand pain, so feeling pain yourself, are not so different from the networks that we use to feel empathy. And the theory assumes that when we see another person feeling pain, we simulate this emotional state, so the pain, in ourselves as if we were experiencing it ourselves. And this is why the theory says, well, maybe the same brain networks are used because we simulate the emotional state of the other. And this way we use the same networks in the brain that would also be active if we feel that pain ourselves.
So what's happening in the brain looks almost the same for seeing someone else experiencing pain as if you were experiencing
Exactly.
it
So there's
yourself.
this kind of overlap. Of course, it's not exactly the same. So I think that the areas for feeling pain yourself are much bigger, just because the saliency is much higher. So of course, if you get pain yourself, it's a different experience than seeing pain in someone else. But the interesting thing is that some of these regions show overlaps in both processes. And this is also what I'm investigating. So there are two, let's say, major networks in the brain that are representing pain or that are processing pain. One network is the so-called affective motivational network. And it consists of regions, for example, like the anterior insula or the anterior and mid-cingulate cortices. And those are mainly active when we try to subjectively judge the pain. So whether we think it's unpleasant, whether we want to withdraw from it, things like that. And then there's the more sensory or basic aspect, and it's called sensory discriminative component. And this is active more for the basic representation of pain. So it codes for the physical characteristics, like where is the pain on my body? What type of pain? Is it sharp? Is it stinging? Is it long lasting? Or is it really short? So more the basic perception. And this is represented in the somatosensory cortices in the brain. And both of these networks, so affective and sensory, have been found also in empathy. And there's a lot of evidence for an overlap in the affective network, which to me makes sense because, of course, we can feel the pain as unpleasant for ourselves, but we can also relate to the pain of another person by feeling unpleasant. But what is less well researched is the role of the sensory network, because I think it makes complete sense that when you feel pain, you have a representation of that in your somatosensory brain regions. But if you see pain of other people, why would your own somatosensory regions play a role? And this is what I'm investigating to find out what the somatosensory network is doing.
So there's a lot going on there, and I think it's made me think a lot. This is very much about people in relation to other people. I'm particularly interested in the self-other idea. Can you give us more detail there?
Yeah, also this theory that I'm investigating, the shared representations theory, it's always about connecting self and other and trying to find similarities and differences between self-experience and other related experience. And of course, since we are social animals, so to say, and we come in contact so much with humans all the time, be it in friendships, at work, or in romantic relationships, and we constantly have to process our surroundings. And a big part of these surroundings are emotions, not only of ourselves, but of others. So we have to also, from an evolutionary perspective, kind of process all of this and try to make sense of it and relate this to each other. So I think that this theory makes a lot of sense, that in the sense that self and other are related, but should also be distinguished in order to live a life normally and not go crazy because you're feeling everything all of the time.
Is that part of the distinction between the emotional contagion and empathy again? This idea of self-other, the example you talked about with babies, at that particular time, they don't necessarily see themselves as a self that's separate to other people. So you need that understanding that you're a specific entity in yourself compared to other people who are separate to you to have that actual empathy experience.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that the sense of self, it develops quite early in life, maybe not as a baby, but quite early as a child. And it takes a while to integrate this with the perspective of another person and to understand the differences and also why, for example, I'm feeling something, but the other person is not feeling this, or the other way around. And also this automatic response that leads to emotional contagion, it still happens in adults. So it's not like we don't experience this anymore. But the difference is to maybe babies is that we have learned to cognitively process this automatic reaction to someone else's emotion. So instead of also starting to cry, we realize, and this happens, of course, super fast in the brain, we realize that this person must be upset. Maybe we feel some unpleasantness due to that, but we don't let it drift into something that we call personal distress. So this happens when we cannot separate self and other related emotions, and then it leads to us being it's especially true for the negative emotional states. It happens to us feeling bad because we are influenced by emotions around us. And this, the goal is to avoid this.
I think that's a big part of philosophical traditions and some religious traditions like Buddhism, that a lot of life is about, and even the experience of pleasure is about avoiding pain. So I wonder if empathy, maybe this is getting into areas that you're not really working in, but is empathy playing a role in us generally wanting to avoid situations that make us feel uncomfortable? And even when we see it in other people, we have an experience of, well, if that was me, I would feel uncomfortable. I don't like that, so I don't want other people to have that same experience.
Pain is something that we use to learn. And the good thing is that we can not only learn from pain we experience ourselves, but we can also observe others and learn from that. And empathizing, I think, plays a very big role in that. So as you said, when we see someone hurting themselves, for example, putting the hand on the stove, on the hot stove, and then you're like, either you have experienced this before and you can really relate, oh God, this must be really painful, it's not a good idea to do that, or you see it for the first time and you learn not to do that in the future. So I do think that empathy can help us in learning how to avoid, for example, pain or other negative emotions in the future. But then again, it's also something that we have to, so we might also be confronted with more negative emotions of others. So we might have a friend that always tells us about his or her problems, and then we have to deal with that. And it's, if we wouldn't talk to that friend, we wouldn't experience those emotions. So we're kind of, in a sense, actively searching for or actively coming in contact with also negative emotions from other people that we have to deal with. So it's kind of, it goes both ways, I would say.
Yeah. So you've mentioned fMRI there. Tell us about some of the other techniques you're using.
So I started out with fMRI, and that is already, I found, super complex and super cool. So I would have been fine to stay just there. But then usually we try to combine different methods with each other, and we try to measure as many things as possible so we can get a good idea of what's happening and what people are doing, what people are feeling, and why. So let's see. So what I also tried now in a second experiment for my PhD is to measure physiological data. And this can be, for example, an ECG, so an electrocardiogram that measures your heart rate and your pulse. And I also played around a bit with skin conductance, and those are both, they can be measures of arousal.
So if you're experiencing pain, you would get different measurements for you, like your heart rate, your skin conduction.
Exactly. So that's what I'm trying to do. I don't have specific hypothesis, but it's, in that case, I did a behavioral study. So I just had participants sitting in front of a computer and doing a task. And usually we try to have some kind of objective measures as well. And this is why I added the physiological data collection, because if we if we make participants experience pain and then we ask them how painful it feels for them, how they feel about it, it can be very subjective. And participants can, of course, also lie, and they can tell us what they want, and we will never know.
Or they can tell you what they think that you want to hear.
Social desirability is a very big problem, also especially in psychology, I would say, because we measure concepts that can sometimes be easy to guess, and then people know exactly what we want to find, and then they might act a certain way or answer a certain way just because they want to please the experimenter, which is, I mean, they mean well, but it's not what we want.
And there's some kind of natural response there, isn't there? That's coming from this kind of social nature of us as humans.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I mean, even I think that the wish to please the experimenter is not as big as trying to, I don't know, do a good job, for example, in the task. And I think that most of the time, if participants come to take part in studies, those participants are already interested in science in general, and they are interested in what we are investigating. So they try to comply as best as possible.
And then I think the other cool bit of kit that sounds like super cool science tech is TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation.
Oh, yeah. And I'm actually going to learn this next year. So it's something that I have not tried yet, but I can tell you a bit about it. It's different to fMRI and also EEG, where we measure brain activity, or we try to measure brain activity, because sometimes we might not only want to measure what's happening in the brain when people, for example, experience pain, but we might want to more directly or more causally examine the role of a certain brain region, for example. And one possibility is to do so-called lesion studies. So if a person has a condition and therefore, for example, doesn't have a certain brain region, or that brain region is damaged somehow, then we can examine how the person reacts, or how a person can behave and act without that brain region. But of course, this rarely happens in real life. So TMS is a really cool method to temporarily either inhibit or activate a certain brain region. So it stimulates nerve cells in the brain using magnetic fields, and then through this current that is used to stimulate a certain area, we can either kind of shut down a brain region or activate it and excite it. And then we can see what this does to certain behavior or beliefs, for example.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting there you're talking about kind of activating or deactivating particular areas. How do you actually go about doing that?
So I think that the way that you do it is you have a really big coil, a machine that has a kind of a coil that you put on top of the head, and you have to estimate where you want the coil to stimulate. So you have to work with brain coordinates to find out the correct region, basically, to stimulate, because we don't want to stimulate the wrong brain region, and brain regions are not that big, especially ones that are deep in the brain. So it might not always be super easy. So I think that is really important to have the right material and the right method to do that. But once you have the region there, in TMS, it kind of produces a slightly unpleasant sensation for the participant, because there is this current going through the brain, essentially to that brain region. It can produce, for example, sounds and muscle movements. So of course, it depends where the current goes through. But for example, if it goes through the motor cortex, we might feel some twitches on our fingers or on our feet. And this is actually what TMS is sometimes also tested to see whether you got the right region in the motor cortex, is to stimulate a region there and then see whether the, let's say, left index finger moves. And I tried this actually when I was in my bachelor, and that was also already like, whoa, we can actually do that. It's crazy.
Well, I think the whole concept of it just sounds amazing, that we can do, like, being able to map the brain to such an accurate level that you can then, like, use this actual technique with the idea of the coil and locating where it should be for a particular region. I just think that's amazing.
Yeah, and in Vienna, since a few years, there's a group, for example, that tries to do fMRI in combination with TMS. So they came up with a TMS coil that can be used inside the scanner, because the scanner, the fMRI scanner, is nothing else than a big magnet. And then we bring in the TMS coil, which is, again, a magnet. And those, of course, interact, and they can cause a lot of interference. So it's not that easy to combine the two. But I think they managed, and they are doing quite some interesting studies on that. So to stimulate a certain region in the brain, while at the same time measuring brain activity over time and see how that changes. And I just think that's super cool how different methods can be combined.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I guess, like you're saying as well, combining those two methods in kind of one technique, but then having research projects that work over that range of equipment and ways of experimenting to really solidify the evidence you have for your hypothesis.
Exactly. And I mean, that's also one thing it took me a bit of time to realize, is that science is also a lot of trying out and failure. So failure, not in a negative sense, but you just have to, you don't know how to measure certain things. You don't know what the results will be. And it might be that you had one small mistake and you should rather redo the experiment, because you might not trust your results because of this, let's say, confound, for example.
So if we come back to your experiments then, in terms of the people that you're experimenting on, have you seen a lot of difference in terms of their experiences of empathy and pain through your work?
Oh, yes. I mean, pain on its own is something that is so individually different. It's crazy. And that is why the first thing I learned in studying pain is that you have to be very individualistic. So for example, we calibrate the pain tolerance of each participant separately. And I even had an experiment where I gave electrical stimulation on two hands, so the right and left hand, and I had to calibrate each of those hands separately, because the pain tolerance can even differ within a person depending on the body part. It's really crazy. So I think that it's important to get things like that right in order to then be able to compare people, because in psychology usually what we do is we don't look at single participants' results, but we look at results on the group level. But in order to do that, we need to make the experience similar for all people. And so this is why I calibrate the pain. And then I give participants shocks, and I tell them to rate this pain on a scale from 0 to 8, with 8 being very, very painful and 0 being I don't feel anything. And then I calibrate all my participants, and then in the task, so when they're actually doing the task where they get pain or another person gets pain, I give them electrical stimulation that they rated as a 7 before. So very painful, but still tolerable. And through this process, I can hopefully assume that this pain that was rated as a 7 by everybody is also a similar pain intensity for everyone.
How do you feel yourself as you're doing these experiments, studying the idea of empathy, and you're inflicting pain on people, albeit obviously like small amounts of pain, but does that kind of trigger empathy for you as you're working through your experiments?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm always, or at least especially in the beginning, I was very afraid that I give people too much pain, for example. And this is, I mean, nobody wants that, of course, but I also always really felt bad. And in psychology, a lot of the time no, wait, I cannot say that. I think I will not tell this story. It's bad because then people might not come to my studies anymore.
Okay.
No, what I wanted to say is that we, especially in the research of pain, you have to be careful and you have to think about the benefits and the advantages of what you're doing compared to how unpleasant it will be for the participants. And this is also why we always have to hand in a proposal to the ethics committee of our university or city to make sure that also external people agree on that this research is valid and okay and should not harm people.
And the electric shock element, that seems to be quite common to psychology. Like I can think of a few kind of experiments involving pain where electric shock is what's being used.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very popular method because it's very easy. There are also other types of pain. So physical pain can, for example, also be inflicted with the so-called cold pressor test. And this is so this is kind of a one-time thing where you ask the participant to put their hand in very, very cold water and then keep it there until it feels painful for them, or say from what point on it's painful, and then take the hand out so keep it in as long as they can and take it out if they cannot bear it anymore. And then there's also thermal or laser pain. But in essence, it's physical pain that you feel on some part of the body. And to me, was also my understanding of pain. And then when I started my master, I found out that there are also, let's say, non-physical types of pain. So I did my master thesis in the domain of autism spectrum disorder, and it was also related to empathy. But instead of physical pain, we used social pain. And this means that in my case, we played a virtual ball game with the participants. So the participants had to throw a ball around with some other people in a virtual reality world. And then sometimes they didn't get the ball, so they were excluded from the ball game. And it sounds really, I mean, if you say it like this, I would think this doesn't bother people too much because it's just a game with people that they don't know. And as an adult, usually you don't play ball games. But the fact is that people are really annoyed by this, and they do feel excluded. And there have been lots of studies on this. It's called cyberball, on this ball game. And it's crazy the negative reactions that people have to a pain that is not physical, that is just due to others not including them.
I suppose the difference there for adults would be kids and adults would maybe experience that pain, but adults would deal with it in a different way.
Yeah, I can imagine that. I mean, I don't know of a study doing cyberball with children, but I think there are lots of studies. And maybe they also compared adults and children. And I did this study with high functioning autism spectrum disorder adults. And so most of them told me afterwards, yeah, I mean, it was a bit annoying that I had to wait to get the ball. I didn't really like that. And they did feel some kind of exclusion in that way. But others also told me that they felt taken back to their childhood on the playground when they didn't get the ball. So it kind of, if you're in a situation like this, it can also trigger past experiences, I think.
Yeah, definitely something you need to be really careful about.
Yeah, exactly.
As you were talking about physical pain and then social pain, I was wondering, is there an emotional kind of pain that we can actually measure, that it's possible to use in experiments as well?
Yeah, so there have been studies who ask participants to, for example, think of a romantic rejection. So think of their ex-partner. And I always, I was really surprised when I heard these studies, because to me it is it seems very hard to measure. But they did find, for example, brain activity in regions that I said before, like anterior insula or cingulate cortex, that often appear when we try to measure empathy and also other types of pain. So there are also lots of studies comparing how similar or different types of pain are, so social pain or physical pain. And there's a big debate that is still going on that one group of researchers say, yeah, it's very similar. There's an overlap. So we use the same brain regions not only to process physical pain, but also social pain in ourselves and in others. And then there are other researchers saying, well, even though the regions overlap, so even though we have activity in the same brain regions, that doesn't necessarily mean that we use the same exact neurons to do that. So to process both of these things. And there are multiple methods that are also still being developed and being used to try to disentangle that, because it's not that easy to find out.
Empathy seems one of those traits that I've seen come up in personality psychology that shows differences between male, female, gender differences. Is that something you find in your work as well?
So in our lab, we do studies that kind of look at gender differences. And I think there's really an abundance of studies that also find gender differences in empathy. I'm not directly researching that. But for example, we try to take care of that. In the beginning, the studies that I did used, let's say the second participant that was getting shocks and that you were supposed to empathize with was always a female, because previous studies have found that you might empathize more with a female than with a male.
Does that matter what your first participant's gender is?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that easy. And then we realized that maybe it's better to have the same sex. So to have a female empathizing with a female and a male empathizing with a male. And it's, to be honest, I still haven't quite found the perfect way to do this. And usually in the studies that I'm doing, I'm not looking directly at gender differences, but I'm just doing half-half. So I'm inviting half of my participants that are female, half that are male, and then I just pool over them in my group analysis. And if I want, I could look at half the sample that is only female and then the other sample that is male, and then try to find out if there's something different.
And what do you hope to do with your research in the future? Where would you like it to go, and how would you like it to be applied?
Yeah, so one thing that I realized is that social processes like empathy are very complex and very hard to understand and to grasp. So for me, going forward, I think it's important that I investigate the first-hand pain experience a bit better. So I also want to go more in how do we feel pain ourselves? How is this represented in the brain? What brain regions are important? And then maybe go back to empathy and try to relate this more to social processes, because I think there's still so much we don't know about pain itself in our own body that I need to learn a bit more first before I can understand what is happening in empathy. And although a lot of the processes seem to be similar, I think there are always, as always in research, multiple answers to a question like that. So I think focusing on first-hand pain is a definite goal of mine to better grasp what empathy is and how it is processed.
And that's a very fantastically humble answer as well, I think. Helena, I think that's a really great place to stop. Thanks very much for your time. That's been really enjoyable.
Thanks so much for inviting me. And I think it's so cool that people outside of my research field are interested in empathy, because I think it's something that we can all relate to. So it's nice to talk about it.
That sounds like a brilliant place to stop. But before we do you want to direct people to website, Twitter, things like that?
Yeah, so I have my own website that I showcase all of my research, what I'm doing, and I also update regularly. That is helenahartmann.com. And then I'm also very active on Twitter. So, of course, you can also follow me there. And I'm always happy if I get emails or contacted via other social media if anyone has questions.
And I'll have all of those on the website so people can make sure they go and find out more about your work.
Perfect.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Remember to rate and review the show on your podcast app to help get us noticed, and you can get in touch on Twitter or through the website. Bye for now. Curiosity Cake.